Welcome to Practical Shamanism. I'm Katie Weatherup. I'm a former engineer with 20 years of experience working as a shamanic practitioner, and I hope to help you to connect to your personal power and magic, and to support you in living a really good life that just keeps getting better. Thank you so much for joining me. So before I jump into today's topic, I just want to remind everyone how much I appreciate it if you participate in some way that's really supportive of my work and my business. So that could look like sharing this with like-minded people so I can grow my podcast audience, leaving a 5-star review if it resonates for you. I really appreciate it when people take a moment to just check out my other offerings and see if there's something that resonates. If you like what I'm sharing, I have a whole academy where I talk for hours and hours about topics that I think are really relevant. And I appreciate hearing from people if this has touched you in some way or blessed your life. It's kind of an odd thing to sit alone in a room and talk into a microphone, so I don't always see the impact or the ripples. And so no pressure, but if you feel called and this has had value for you, I'd love to hear that. So on to today's topic. I was having a conversation with my chiropractor, who is a super neat guy, and we share a lot of things in common about kind of our worldview of being sort of geeky about the hacks and the knowledge and the information that's available to us on how to really support our bodies in being as healthy as possible and the complexity of that. So I have all these like little short, interesting conversations. At one point, we were both getting into cold plunging together and talking about, what we knew and, why this was interesting to us. And I adore how much information is available to us about different ways to really support our body in thriving. For example, I'm a big fan of Dr. Chatterjee's podcast that really breaks down a lot of the new authors and, cutting edge information. And one of the ways I like to approach my considerable geekiness about all of these kind of things is in service to finding the way that requires the least discipline and willpower and struggle and the most ease that's going to give me absolutely the most results. Because one of the things that can be really overwhelming is we have so much information about so many different things that it can be overwhelming. And I think it's easy also along the journey to sort of have that designated expert. So one of the things that I really love about shamanism is in the modern era where we can, learn in classrooms or online and seek out this kind of training as we feel called, we have this opportunity to have a direct personal connection to the divine. And this is really radical because society has been organized even back in tribal times, before we, converted over to organized religions and cities and the Industrial Revolution. But, even going back into our indigenous history, things were still organized around the notion that there should be some kind of spiritual expert or person that would work on your behalf to speak to the divine. And part of why I'm so specific about calling myself a shamanic practitioner instead of a shaman is noting that I'm providing expertise in this area, but we all have the opportunity to have our own direct access to wisdom. So before I babble on about the thing that I want to babble on about that was sparked by this, I want to kind of remind you, if you're thinking about lifestyle practices and what works for you, that using your intuition, using the information from your body, from your guides, from feeling into what really aligns, because we have all of these doctors and authority figures that are telling us, with the best of intentions, what we should be doing with our body. And some of it can even be really contradictory. There are people who are leaving aside the ethical considerations, are just in terms of our physical health adamant that eating meat is a horrible idea, and others that are like, as long as it's the right meat, it's, super important. And that's really diametrically opposed information with people who feel strongly on either side of the fence. And while it would be in some ways, I think, super nice to come up with just an off-the-shelf, straightforward protocol, do this, do that, I think there are a lot of, diet plans. I remember in the 80s, NutriFast or something along those lines that were like, look, you'll just drink the shakes and have a sensible dinner, and then your weight will be what you want. And I think there's a lot of appeal to that, even though in fairly short order, when we have that do these things exactly as I tell you, are obstinate, defiant, you're not the boss of me, arguing with authority, power struggle stuff can really come up. But at the same time, left with all of this information and all of this information to reckon with amid all the other busyness of life. So when someone has a health diagnosis, a lot of times they can get super present with, all right, I need to put my health on an upward spiral in a really specific way on a really specific timeline. And then they can, laser focus in and be in the research and development. And there's really high motivation for a lot of people if they're dealing with a health outcome that left untreated and unchecked will take them down a path they don't want to be on. But I am such a fan of, really working to proactively not have those kind of things that necessitate intervention from Western medicine. So grateful I have Western medicine, absolutely appreciate everything it can do, and I'm really trying to need as little of it as possible. And these questions, as someone who has, enjoyed really overall good health for most of my life and really had that be an upward spiral. Like I am so much healthier at 49 than I was in my 20s or even my 30s. And there are a multitude of factors. My fight or flight isn't activated all the time. I'm not in constant stress response. I don't have the social anxiety. My connections are better. I have a whole bunch of, mindset and soul health and aspects to that. But some of it is just upgraded lifestyle changes. As I've done more healing, more aligned things became more available for me. But one of the things I notice for a lot of people is with this incredible abundance of information, it's easy to get overwhelmed. And a lot of us have this kind of perfectionism where we can feel like we're constantly like, oh, but I'm failing at this and I'm eating the wrong this, or I'm not eating this, or, there can be this constant critical review of our lifestyle that dovetails with, people who have a little bit of shame or perfectionism or tendency to overachieve. There are these kind of psychological things that are really, really common. I've dealt with a lot of them myself that can end up making it be really painful to go into a podcast or a book with a new idea because it's can be an indictment of everything that we are or are not doing as far as lifestyle practices. I remember in my 20s, I knew that exercise would be good and I wasn't getting a lot of it. And I got early to an appointment at one point and I decided, I'll take a walk. It happened to be near the ocean and there's this beautiful trail along the cliffs. And as I'm walking along, moving my body, I'm reviewing all of my inadequacies around exercise and feeling bad about that. And I'm like, oh man, if I stop distracting and numbing and actually do the thing and it stirs up all of this self-judgment and shame, it's no wonder I avoid exercise. Who would want to exercise when their brain takes this as, I'm not up to anything else. Let's discuss your, various failings. And I've cleaned up a lot of that. My inside of my head is a much friendlier neighborhood than it was at other times in my life. But I recently was geeking out on a book I'm really enjoying. It's called Fast Like a Girl. And she, starts out with some really clear, compelling information about fasting. And then she goes into like everything I know in the kitchen sink about all these things that would be really supportive. And it's a lot. And I'm needing to self-coach myself to say, hey, let's onboard these things a little bit at a time. So I want to emphasize that it's really cool to be geeky about health and being in that like, oh, how interesting. I can find the low-hanging fruit where the least effort on my part produces the most results and really enjoy the effectiveness of that. And I would invite you to try something I've kind of been enjoying where as someone who was, all through, grade school, the straight A student, my dad joked that I needed a wheelbarrow to take home all the academic rewards I received when I graduated from high school. And a lot of that had to do with being in a fairly small agricultural community that just didn't have that emphasis. There just weren't a lot of my graduating class that were going directly to a four-year college. And so as a result, I joke, I say tongue in cheek, I was the queen of the nerds, terrible social skills, perfectionism, anxiety, stress. I'm not recommending my teenage years to anyone. It was an awkward and in many ways painful way of getting through them. But I was the undisputed queen of the nerds because I took academic decathlon, and both years I took it, I got the highest overall score. So of the nerdy kids who thought competing for academic on top of all the coursework we were learning was a good idea, I was the nerdiest of the nerds. So there's something really powerful and fun about saying of my lifestyle choices, yeah, I think I'm about an 8 out of 10. Yeah, I think I'm about a B with my lifestyle choices. I do these things and they're good and really supportive. And, overall, I don't eat this and I do eat this. But hey, I might eat ice cream or pizza or, these things that someone who was being more rigorous might not do. And the kind of joy in letting myself be, like B seems like a really solid place when I'm enjoying overall good health. And I appreciated getting my blood work back to give me feedback on whether my approach is enough. Because one of the things I think is really useful about health is, are you doing enough with your lifestyle that you're in a really sustainable place that really works for you? If you're in a downward spiral where something is getting worse and worse over time, that's a place where getting more focused on kind of the interventions are. But for the chiropractor I was chatting with, and for me, we're both kind of in a place where overall we have really good health results and we're, aware of kind of where some of the complexity lies. And he was talking about late night snacking while watching TV over, eating things that weren't healthy for him while he was hanging out with his teenager. And he was saying, I even chatted with my teenager about how, certain snacks aren't as healthy as his teenage son is all into athletics and doing very, very well at them. And he said, gosh darn it, my son totally heard me and stopped snacking on popcorn, but, here I am still doing it. And what popped into my head, really obscure throwaway thing that someone I was following for completely different content mentioned, which was that she would chew gum while watching TV because she was vulnerable to late night snacking of things that weren't really good for her body. And she made the point, and it really resonated for me, that a lot of television isn't something that you really need your whole attention on to get most of the plot. There are super smart, incredibly nuanced shows where information is being conveyed with a look or an exchange, and there's this real need to be present to follow along because so much is being conveyed in a whole lot of different ways. But that's a very, very small percentage of what we're seeing on TV. Most of it is set up where we can be like checking our iPhone in between or doing other things like that. And so what's interesting, I'm just taking this kind of little moment where there's a vulnerability to making lifestyle choices that aren't congruent with the desired results. And what sort of popped into my head, we didn't develop the whole conversation, which so you're getting to hear about it on my podcast, is how much our instincts that are really trying to keep us alive as hunter-gatherer people and don't have the up-to-date information are constantly working in the background. So from a hunter-gatherer perspective, everything's relaxed, everything's calmed down. There's an excess of food, and why don't you eat some while you sit around the fire and tell stories with each other and hang out socially? This is a fantastic idea, and it would be a really functional choice because secure access to food wasn't available. So when there was excess food that was unclaimed, they didn't have food preservation, it was going to spoil. It was extremely foolish not to go with the feast or famine cycle and feast when it was in a feast cycle. And we're in this, really advantageous place in the modern world where we kind of get to stay in the feast cycle all the time. I know that, there are certain people experiencing hunger, but the vast majority of humans have secure access to food, which is awesome. Yay, us. Totally appreciate that, but it creates this other problem where the instincts have this way that they're trying to get us to move. And one of the ways that I like to think about the instincts is they communicate with tension in our body. So there's the impulse to just go into the kitchen and, grab something. And it's easy to do without even thinking about it. At times when I've, tended to keep grabbing, a handful of chocolate-covered almonds way too often, I've actually put them into another cupboard if I wasn't wanting to say, there'll be no chocolate almonds, so that I would break I didn't check in with myself about this, whether this is really the food choice I want to make, or if I'm just kind of in flow state and wrapped up in something and trying to keep my brain, going along, so I don't have to stop and actually get present with making a meal, which, is totally something that I've been known to get up to. So one of the ways I like to think about the instincts, and incidentally, side note, before I say that, the guides want me to drop in, whenever I'm looking at lifestyle choices, I'm trying to lean as lightly as possible on willpower. I'm trying to lean into inspiration and excitement. And so, for something like weight loss, I don't want to pay as much attention to weight loss as here's something that will make your body work in this amazing way. Here's something that could be really supportive. So wanting weight loss is kind of a weird path to go down, but wanting to have a body that is really healthy, that will age well, that has sustainability. I love all the research on exercise about how even 10 minutes makes your mood better for like the next 24 hours, and your brain works so much better. And there's lots of good cardiovascular reasons for exercise, but long-term brain health is really in there. And so leaning into something that you really desire, that inspires you, is great. And having habits and systems that are set up so it's really easy. A lot of my less optimal food choices come out of speed rather than necessarily being so committed to having the sugary snack rather than something else. I know I'm talking about food, but this could be all kinds of things: sleep, exercise, stress level, all of these different areas that are so pivotal. But it's interesting because the research can even show that, once we get out of balance in the gut biome, that we will have more intense cravings for things that feed the bacteria that's not as supportive as the better bacteria. And once you get that rebalance, the intensity of cravings go down. But going to that thing where, we've done all the hard mental labor for the day, it is good and appropriate to read a book, to watch a movie, to, have this kind of nice, relaxed, being entertained. We'd be sitting around the campfire, hearing people tell their stories of the adventures of the day, or back in the day, this was the thing. Or looking at agricultural times where you'd be, sitting around the fire debriefing about how all the animals are doing. I grew up on a teeny tiny farm and, that was dinner conversation, checking in and reporting and strategizing about, keeping the animals all alive and healthy. So when we're not completely committed to results, the instinct thinks it's a really great time to put us to work doing things. And part of why I think content is so appealing when we're tired is sometimes the instincts want to ruminate on how we might have messed up or what bad things could happen in the future, and that's no fun. So distracting TV or books or audiobooks or whatever are lovely. They really, I think, are a great thing, and I just love the richness of the windows we get to look into, and if you're amusing yourself on TikTok or you're watching YouTube videos or whatever it is, I'm so in favor of that kind of mental downtime. If it becomes, too big a slice of the pie to the point that you're neglecting really important things, that's different. But as something that is a slice of the pie, I think it serves a really nice purpose in our life. But this may or may not come up for you, so you can take it as an analogy and find where it might apply in your life, or it may be a direct experience you have, but that desire to, kind of mindlessly munch on something that might not be as supportive for your body as you would prefer. And it's not to say sometimes snacks aren't fun, but if it's a, repetitive thing and you find yourself doing it even when you decided not to, which I think happens a lot with our health choices for very valid reasons, it's nice to kind of get into the conversation with yourself about, what is this? And so it came to me that, chewing gum is really helpful because it will cue the instincts that something is happening with the mouth, and therefore, it doesn't need to send you into the kitchen for a snack with all of those kind of low-level rewards. I really like knitting. Again, TV doesn't tend, with some exceptions, to hold all of my attention, but if I'm knitting something or crafting in some way, that's a really nice balance. It seems to take up the fullness of me being entertained in my experience, and if my hands are occupied with yarn, I'm probably not, tempted to eat chips because you don't want chip grease on your pretty natural yarn that you have, painstakingly acquired. But one of the places of compassion that I think is good to kind of look at for what's happening in the background is the dynamic with, small children who are also being run by their instincts that are, trying to get them to behave in advantageous ways and avoid, the ones that aren't advantageous. And they have all the wiring with, lots of pleasure rewards for eating sugar and salt and fat and all of these, simple carbs that are so abundant in our world. So whether you have kids or not, you could probably, relate and imagine the experience of being at the grocery store with a kid. They're always going to be begging for treats. Can I have this? Can I have that? I want, I hope, I want. Even if they know there's almost no chance, if you're a kid in the store, it's kind of boring. You might as well, get up to seeing if a parental boundary would be available to be collapsed in this particular moment, even if there's, a very small chance. Sometimes like our pets, I had a moment where I had designed something to try to keep my cat from doing something that was difficult, and she got around it. And I'm like, well, I'm kind of embarrassed that my calico is a better engineer than I am. However, I put in 15 minutes and she really had nothing else she had to do to solve the problem. Her food is provided, her water is provided, so she could give all of her attention to this project. And, for kids, going through the grocery store, they're, getting all the advertising messages, the bright colors, the packaging, and so of course they're going to beg for the candy bar or the chips or the thing that is on the edge and maybe I could get away with it. That's, the parents' negotiation of well, it's not the worst food. It's not the best, but it's not the worst. So For a parent who's in that situation, a lot of kind of what parents get up to is knowing that, their children's impulse control isn't well developed. So they won't know that there'll be a lot of discomfort that follows from eating an entire carton of ice cream. As an adult, we can make a judicious choice. We know what the consequences will be. We know how we'll probably feel later. We do it or we don't. It's cool. But for a child, there's no sense of time in that way. Their brain isn't developed. And so it's an appropriate role of parents to moderate how much ice cream a child is allowed to have in one sitting and under what conditions. Like if you've already eaten your vegetables and have a good protein base, it's going to be a lot easier to deal with sugar in a moderate amount than as a, mid-afternoon snack, which, will cause zoomies and crankiness and failure to eat dinner and all kinds of things. Varies widely depending on the child. But thinking about that dynamic where the child is like, please, 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 I want it. Could I? And from the parent's point of view, they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that if they give in to this unrelenting pressure from the child to get what it wants, and it could be food, it could be, take me to the movies, it could be come play on the trampoline with me, it could be anything that just isn't appropriate for everything that's going on. But there's so much about children just hammering at parents' boundaries, especially in the modern era where it's frowned upon to arbitrarily smack children just because they're annoying you. So this natural behavior of trying to obtain the most happiness and joy and the best outcomes is really normal. And as a parent, you're constantly holding that discipline of, wow, if I give in to this, I will reinforce the behavior and I can look forward to an escalation in the efforts because, the boundary could be collapsed. And my parents were, really, really good at holding nope, these are the rules, this is the structure, this is how it works. I remember my mom relating an experience where, she, was very adamant about trying to limit our sugar intake as children, and having all this judgment. Why would people give their children these, things that are so bad for them? And then there was a day when she relented and we got ice cream and she said, and it was silent. The children stopped squabbling. And I went, I know why people give their children these things. So you have this trade-off to make as a parent where you're like, well, the greater good is served by, holding the line. But if I, collapse the boundary and let them have the candy bar, but that's the only treat and you can't mention it again, deals incidentally that children will not necessarily keep once the candy bar is obtained because, young children, not good deal makers. They'll wheel and deal like crazy, but they don't always, have the cognitive capacity to follow through. But much like our instincts where you're like, okay, I'm only going to have, one small serving of ice cream. And then you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that sounds good. And then you have that and you're like, well, maybe I'll just have one more small serving of ice cream, that kind of analogy. And so what I want to invite here is a lot of compassion where you have this part of you that is just hammering away in the background, creating tension and throwing the idea on the screen of your mind that you could have this, high caloric density, low nutritional value snack while you were watching TV, and all of the arguments and justifications and, well, I went to the gym today or I'll go to the gym tomorrow. Like these parts of ourselves are really good bargainers. And, I think it's fundamentally important in dealing with ourselves and other people to recognize what wheeler and dealers our brains are in service to justifying something that we really want. And the brain really can justify anything. But the experience that you're having when you're winding down and watching TV and you've used a lot of your willpower for the day and you're in this relaxed state and your brain has some open space because the program you're watching doesn't take all of your concentration and you're relaxed and mellow, it's just a great time for the instincts to try to get you to do something pleasurable that would, from their point of view, serve to enhance your survival capacity. And so in the position of using our self-efficacy and our ability to make choices, we're kind of up against a part of us that lives inside of us that doesn't have a lot else to do. That's like, do the thing, do the thing, do the thing, do the thing. And if we're really centered, it's easier to work with. But if we're emotional, and so there'd be a really extra nice bonus to that release of, dopamine and serotonin and happy chemicals that come with eating these kind of foods, it's even more tempting. And this could apply to a glass of wine, emotional numbing stuff, because the instincts treat emotions sometimes as survival threats. So there's just this part of us that is like the kid in the store that knows there's like a 25% chance, if they're obnoxious enough, that the parent will relent and buy them the treat they want. And so they're pushing, 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 pushing. And of course the parent knows that if they, collapse the boundary and put it on the table, then they can look forward to even more relentless hounding, with future store visits. But the immediate relief of the quietness is a legitimate need, especially with there being so many more stressors as being a parent. And again, whether you have children or not, this is a dynamic that I think we've all witnessed wandering through stores, and parents, depending on how frazzled and exhausted they are, I think it's way better to, collapse the boundary and give your child a candy bar, even knowing that you'll pay for it later, than, absolutely losing your shit and smacking your child, or, tearing things off the shelf and smashing them, or whatever, is going on. Sometimes we just have to bring the level of stimulation and stress down, whatever it takes. And that's super valid. So none of this is to judge parents for, their ways of navigating this complexity. But I want to illuminate this so that when you're reckoning with this, if it's a pattern, or if something else like it is a pattern, that your instincts are this persistent trying to get you to do the thing, trying to get you to do the thing. And the more you resist, the more they feel like you're taking adverse action. So they'll just go on and on and on and on. And in a quiet, relaxed situation where you don't have a lot to process, that voice and level of tension and the amount that it's showing up on your brain, that you would like to just shut up so that you could enjoy your book or your program or whatever, can really get intense. And I think it's useful to recognize the mechanism that's in play here, because I think it's really easy to, go into some kind of self-judgment, like, wow, I have no willpower. I think we, have a lot of stories about the plan of what we're going to do for our health or our lifestyle, and then the experience is different. And if we're expecting that we're a good predictor about what we will or won't do when we don't reliably do or not do the thing, it can undermine self-trust. So I am a huge fan when it comes to lifestyle choices of being really committed to putting time and attention and energy and focus and listening to feedback from my body and noticing when things are starting to swing out. I've experienced that I do better if I minimize gluten. Fortunately, my body doesn't have sensitivity at the level I need to eliminate it, but I got to a point where the amount of gluten budget I was allowing myself got bigger than it's been, and I started to have the kind of inflammation markers that go with eating more gluten, that, not loud. My body's not screaming at me. I'm not having really distressing responses, but it's a energy leak of the experience I want to have that, is something that was showing up at a really low level. So we can keep faith with ourselves, and we can become self-trusting if we're like, well, I have no idea if I'm going to make it to the gym tomorrow like I planned, but what I know about setting myself up for success is these are all the things that work best to wrangle myself. So I've got the bag in the car, and I'm not going to try to come home before that, or, whatever it is. For me, as a lifelong reluctant exerciser, the Oculus headset with a program called Supernatural that has you like beating up balloons in, these gorgeous places on Earth has been really effective for being the most consistent with exercise I've ever been. And it's just a great secret sauce because I'm working from home, so it's attainable. I can jump in between clients. I can lie to myself and tell myself I'm only going to do just 10 minutes, just the 10 minutes that get you the better results of your brain functioning and your mood. And then once I'm in it, often I'm willing to go longer. Sometimes I'm not. Sometimes it doesn't thing, but it's not the commitment of needing to like leave my lair and go all the way to the gym and change clothes. I do it barefoot, so I have this availability. And it's a really good thing to recognize that if our willpower is super high, we can use it to do hard things. But then when life gets complicated, which it does, we're all balancing our income, our relationships, just the complexities of life, that things like this will slip away. So having systems that make lifestyle practices highly attainable are really supportive, and understanding that we're reckoning with a part of us that is very deeply committed to trying to save our life by getting us to do things that we know are not on the side of our health and well-being is really useful information, because I would never want anyone to shame themselves for not being able to tell themselves no of binge eating snacks while watching TV, even if that was adversely affecting their health. But at the same time, I think it's really useful to unpack the mechanism and start to be in the research and development and the trying things on for how to, sort of thwart that process. And you might chew gum while watching TV, you might knit something, you might play with something else. There's so many lovely things that you could get up to. Personally, I get a lot more chores done because I have audiobooks to keep me company. And so there's, this nice mellow movement of handling the laundry and doing the dishes and things like that are a pleasant part of my day as a result of that being a window when I get to listen to a story I'm really into. So anyway, I hope there's something in here that really supports you. I think that there's a really nice opportunity for depth of relationship with yourself and bringing in your own personal wisdom and intuition and curiosity and creativity in finding how to be in the world, finding how to move through the world. And I think when we get out of this willpower or nothing, or trying to follow someone else's program and then, of course, falling short, because it's not our map, that there's a real beauty and elegance to creating sustainability for being in the body. And what I've experienced is the more successful I am with a body that's really thriving, the deeper my connection to source and spirit and intuition and creativity and service and all of these kind of really cool things. It really opens up a lot of what matters to me when that foundation is really solid. So as I said, I hope there's something in here that's useful for you. And I just want to really reiterate my invitation that if there's a way that you can support me in my work, I'd be so grateful, partly because I just love doing this, and the more successful my podcast is at supporting the rest of my business, the more time and energy I can devote to this. If it makes sense as a thing that I love and a creative decision, as well as something that really supports my business, I'll just end up doing more of it, and I really love it. So I'm hoping that we can co-create that win-win together. Again, no pressure. You're totally at choice for what works for you, but I just wanted to offer that invitation for anyone who wants to explore a little more deeply. Thank you so much for joining me. To learn more about me and my work, please visit my website at handsoverheart.com. There you can join my mailing list for access to free bonus content in the members-only area. If you've enjoyed this, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. It would help me out a lot. Also, a special thank you to my patrons for your support. You offer me the time freedom to work on passion projects like this one. If you'd like to receive personal shamanic support from me and my team of guides, please consider joining my Patreon community. You'll find the link below. And again, thank you so much for listening. This is Katie Weatherup, wishing you wholeness and happiness.